Hello, everyone. I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Welcome to this week's History's Lunch program, which is sponsored by the John and Lucy Shackelford Charitable Fund of the Community Foundation for Mississippi. We're in our home, the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium in the Museum of Mississippi History and Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, and we're streaming live on both Facebook and YouTube. And if you have not already done so, please silence your cell phones. This Friday, December 2nd, we'll have our annual Christmas by Candlelight tour. Between 4 and 8 p.m., you can enjoy holiday treats, live music, and decorations at these museums, as well as the State Capitol, Governor's Mansion, Old Capitol Museum, and the Mississippi Museum of Art. Walk or drive to come and go on your own schedule, or park and ride shuttle buses between the sites. This year's Candlelight Tour is in partnership with the City of Jackson's Capital City Lights, and that will continue through 10 p.m. with additional activities. So 4 to 8 for the Candlelight Tour, and then on until 10 o'clock for the Capital City Lights. And then the next day, Saturday, December 3rd, we'll have a holiday open house at the museum store from 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. You can sample food and beverages from Mississippi vendors, meet artists, chefs, and craftspeople whose goods are carried in the store, and find special discounts on merchandise. So come back for that. And then I hope that you'll be with us next Wednesday when Muskogee Nation Tribal Historic Preservation Officer Turner Hunt will present the Muskogee Nation and Mississippi. We'll wrap up the 2023 season of History's Lunch the following week with a conversation between Marty Stewart and Karen Cronin, who worked with him on the book. That fabulous exhibit upstairs closes at the end of the year. If you haven't seen that yet, you owe it to yourself. And then come back and hear Marty talk all about it in a few weeks. Today, we're delighted to welcome Jack D. Elliott to talk about his new University Press of Mississippi book, To the Ramparts of Infinity, Colonel WC Falkner and the Ripley Railroad. Elliott earned his B.A. in anthropology and his M.S. in geography, both from Mississippi State University, where he was adjunct professor of archaeology, geography, and religion at the Meridian campus from 1988 to 2016. From 1985 to 2010, Elliott was a historical archaeologist with MDAH, where he performed a study of Fort Rosalie in Natchez that identified the site and initiated an effort to preserve and promote it that led to the creation of the Natchez National Historical Park. He's the co-author of Cotton Gin Port, a frontier settlement on the Upper Tombigbee with Mary Ann Wells, and West Point and Clay County in the Images of America series with Elizabeth A. Calvert and Rebecca M. Riley. Elliott is a 5-time winner, I think that is the uncontested winner, of the Mississippi Historical Society's Award for Best Article in the Journal of Mississippi History, and is a past president of the Mississippi Association of Professional Archaeologists. Help me welcome Jack Elliott.
Oh, okay. I have to apologize in advance about all this technology and everything. I'm an unavowed Luddite, which means somebody that doesn't like technology. Let me see now, we got a gizmo here. Okay. Thank you, Chris. Chris is really good for helping a poor devil like me get everything together. He's not very good at it. Okay, let's see. To the Ramparts of Infinity, Colonel WC Falkner and the Ripley Railroad. That's the cover of the book. Somebody asked me about, why do you want to write on Colonel Faulkner? Isn't he a white, male, Christian, Southerner, former Confederate, and even bears the title of Colonel? And I said, well, I guess I'm just not that politically correct. Anyway, he sounds a lot like me, and he's a pretty nice fella, I think. The title, To the Ramparts of Infinity, links together with the image of this monument that was built to Colonel Faulkner in the Ripley Cemetery. Still stands there today. It also links in with his vision of the Ripley Railroad. Colonel Faulkner in 1872 built the railroad from Middleton, Tennessee down to Ripley, a distance of 25 miles. And that was initially a spur line, but he continued on with it further south. His vision of it was something that was more than most people have anticipated. They saw it as being, most have just seen it as being the road, a spur line to Ripley, when in fact, incorporated a much bigger transcendental vision. William Faulkner, his great-grandson, described the statue of Colonel John Sartoris in the first novel of Faulkner's Yoknapatawpha Chronicle, Sartoris. He described the monument of Colonel John Sartoris, who is a counterpart of Colonel William Faulkner. And he described the statue. The statue stood on a stone pedestal, his back to the world, and his carven eyes gazing out across the valley where his railroad ran and the blue, changeless hills beyond, and beyond that, the ramparts of infinity itself. So it has this sort of transcendental vision of something beyond, looking toward a distant horizon. And that's in fact what Colonel Faulkner had really visualized. It really had, nobody had pointed out. Here he was, he's a resident of a town, Ripley, Mississippi. There's less than 1,000 population. When nobody else could build a spur line from Middleton, Tennessee down to Ripley, he managed to build a spur line. But instead of stopping there, where everybody else would have anticipated him to stop, he wanted to turn it into a transcontinental railroad, which most people would have thought, well, you know, why isn't he satisfied with just a spur line? In fact, he wanted to build it on from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. So there he kind of stood for the eternal longing for something more, something beyond, further horizons. I began the book with this quote, also from William Faulkner's Sartoris. And they're talking about Colonel Sartoris here in memory. And it emphasized the role of memory in so much of our way we deal with the world. We generally, the past is not present to us except through symbols and through memories. The present, so just a sliver of an infinitely thin slice of time. We know only the the past through memory and the future through anticipation. So memory plays a big role in terms of how we see the world. And here he writes, as usual, old man falls. This is talking about a meeting is in Colonel Sartoris' son's office up in a bank in Jefferson, Mississippi. As usual, old man Falls had brought John Sartoris into the room with him, fetching like an odor, like the clean, dusty smell of his faded overalls, the spirit of the dead man into that room where the dead man's son sat, and where the two of them, pauper and banker, would sit for half an hour in the company of him who had passed beyond death and then returned. Of course, this is all metaphorical, talking about his return into memory and story. But my own memory played a big role in terms of getting this whole project started. In 1973, I got interested in local history. I simultaneously got interested in Faulkner's Yoknapatawpha stories because they were such an analog to the world that I knew and its history in northeast Mississippi, where I'd grown up not too far from where William Faulkner had. He grew up, of course, in Oxford. But my interest in the Yoknapatawpha stories developed at the same time with local history. And a year later, they announced the first Faulkner and Yoknapatawpha meeting in Oxford at the University of Mississippi, which I attended. And one of the tours took us to Ripley. I of course, went on all the tours I could. That was the main thing I was interested in, was touring around and looking at things. Went to Ripley, and there we saw various things that were associated with Colonel Faulkner, and some were accurate and some not so accurate. But years later, I always had this in memory, particularly the monument of Colonel Faulkner in the Ripley Cemetery. Years later, if I happened to be at Ripley, I would always go by the Colonel Faulkner's monument and visit it. And then in 2010, somebody invited me to go to a Faulkner Heritage Festival they were holding in Ripley. So I got back and got exposed to the same places again, but by that time I'd had a lot of experience researching places. So I wound up digging into the Chancery court records, particularly the deed records, going down there systematically. Unfortunately, they didn't even have a deed index to the town lots in Ripley, so I started abstracting each volume off the deed books, going through it a page at a time, finding a Ripley deed, copying it down, and then transcribing it into a big index. My wife always said I have always been obsessive compulsive. She said, you can't ever just look at something and then drop it. You've got to get obsessed with it and just keep on and on and on. Well, I wound up going through the deed books from 1836 until about 1910. Then I started going through the newspapers, old Ripley newspapers and others, until I suddenly realized that there's not a really good biography of Colonel Faulkner out there, and so I wound up moving on towards this biography, which eventually emerged after a good deal of years of research and then other years of writing. Well, the places, for a big degree, the place has always been a stimulus for my imagination to draw me along, as it must have been with William Faulkner to some degree, because his Yoknapatawpha stories were very set in environments that he knew. And we forget how our experience of things really has a different dimension to us. We tend to look at things as though they're just purely matter, something that can be weighed or photographed or whatever. But they affect us differently. They point us to more distant horizons. And I'll read a passage from Niels Bohr's reflections on visiting Kronborg Castle in Denmark in the 1920s, I believe it was. Niels Bohr was, of course, one of the founders of quantum physics, and he, along with Werner Heisenberg, were on a visit to Kronborg Castle, which had been the home of the historical Prince Hamlet, the prototype of the one that was later on became the featured star of Shakespeare's play, Hamlet. Bohr recalled, "Isn't it strange how this castle changes as soon as one imagines that Hamlet lived here? As scientists, we believe that the castle consists only of stones and admire the way the architect puts them together. The stone, the green roof with its patina, the wood carvings in the church constitute the whole castle. None of this should be changed by the fact that Hamlet lived here, and yet it is changed completely. Suddenly the walls and the ramparts speak a different language. The courtyard becomes an entire world. A dark corner reminds us of the darkness in the human soul. We hear Hamlet's "to be or not to be." Everyone knows the question Shakespeare had him ask, the human depths he was made to reveal. And once we know that, Kronborg becomes quite a different castle for us. So places are more than matter. Look at the monument to Colonel Faulkner. It evokes all sorts of historical and literary associations that come together in one place. They point us on to something more. Here we have a couple, getting down to kind of a dry fact business. Here's the only two known photographs, at least there were the only two at the time I published the book, of Colonel Faulkner, both of them I think from the 1880s. Here's the locomotive, one of the first that the Ripley Railroad purchased on their line. It was called the Colonel WC Falkner, and he was nicknamed the Tanglefoot. If any of you are familiar with the Tanglefoot Trail up in northeast Mississippi, the biking trail on the former railroad grade up there, it gets its name from this locomotive, which was really, named Colonel Faulkner. So there's a tangible linkage to the Tanglefoot Trail today, a 43.6 mile biking trail running from Houston through Pontotoc on to New Albany. In doing this biography, I found that you had to constantly cut through stuff that had been said about Colonel Faulkner. It's just total BS, basically. While Maud Morrow Brown wrote an article on him. Sam Brooks. Maud Morrow Brown is a wife of Calvin Sr. But Calvin Brown Sr. was the one that wrote the Archaeology of Mississippi back in the 1920s. That was her husband. Anyway, she wrote, even while he lived, Colonel Faulkner was the subject of amazing and contradictory stories. After his death, these stories multiplied into such fantastic and exaggerated legends that today it is often impossible to divide the true from the false. No truer words. One of the things that I saw on my 1974 visit to Ripley was pointed out was Renfro's Cafe on the corner on the square. It was pointed out was this is where Colonel Faulkner was shot. Colonel Faulkner was shot by one R.J. Thurman, who had formerly been with the railroad. He was shot and died from it. And this was pointed out as being where Thurman's office had sat in 1889 when he shot Colonel Faulkner. Well, that had been every tour they'd point this out as where Colonel Faulkner was shot. Turned out it wasn't true. This was an old office that stood on the side of Renfro's. And you can see where people were coming from. They're pointing this out. This was a Thurman office. So it must have been where Colonel Faulkner was shot. Well, it was actually the law office of Charlie Miller Thurman, who was the son of R.J. Thurman, R.J. Thurman being the one who shot Faulkner. So this was the son's law office. Had nothing to do with the father. As it turns out, I identified the actual office of R.J. Thurman. It was about a half a block to the south. And it's at this site. The office is long since gone, but it's at the site of the Mississippi Gold, Silver, and Coin Exchange. That's where Colonel Faulkner was shot, and he died somewhat over 24 hours later. One other tale is where the origin of where Ecru got its name from. Ecru, of course, is the little town on the railroad that he built. It's in northern Pontotoc County between New Albany and Pontotoc. Ecru is, of course, the name of a color. I didn't even know that. It's not a color you often refer to. I even knew chartreuse, but I didn't know ecru. But the story is that after they built the depot here and they were going to establish a town, they were arguing over what to call it. And supposedly two families' names were contesting for the name of the town. And Colonel Faulkner was brought in to settle the dispute, kind of like King Solomon brought in to solve, decide who was the rightful mother of the baby. Well, Colonel Faulkner, according to this tale, said, after considering the two different names, he said, "Hell, name it after the color of the depot, ecru." And I have no idea whether or not that's true. It's probably not. But some of these stories, you can never falsify them because there's just simply nothing recorded about them at the time. Colonel Faulkner got a reputation that's carried on by his great-grandson, William Faulkner, as being a violent person. William Faulkner referred to his great-grandfather as being grim and violent and humorless. I found out he was just the opposite of all of those. He did, in fact, kill Robert Holt Heineman on the right. But these Heineman boys, they were some bad dudes. They were not to be trifled with. I mean, they would attack you for nothing. Well, there was a temperance society. Of course, temperance back then and still to some degree it doesn't mean moderation in your attitude towards life. Temperance has come to mean abstaining from liquor. They had a temperance society that Faulkner was part of as a young man. He was in his 20s. And apparently Robert Holt Heineman applied to join, but you had to be voted on, kind of like joining a secret society or something. And somebody blackballed Heineman. And it was reported to him that it was Bill Faulkner. Well, Heineman said he was not to be trifled with. He came in to shoot Faulkner on the basis of what somebody had told him, that Faulkner had blackballed him. We don't even know if that's true or not. But apparently Heineman did attempt to shoot him. Back in those days, of course, you had these pistols. You didn't have metal cartridges. You had to stuff your powder in, and then you have percussion caps to ignite the powder. And he tried to shoot Faulkner, and the cap failed. So he tried again, and the cap failed again. And by that time, Faulkner had pulled out his knife, and he stabbed Heineman to death. Because of this, he got the reputation of being very violent. But in fact, I don't have any indications of him being violent unless he was being attacked by some bully. Here's the headstone of Robert Holt Heineman. outside of Ripley. Robert Holt, eldest son of Thomas C. and Sarah Heineman, born 1822, killed at Ripley, Mississippi by William C. Faulkner, May 8, 1849. Kind of funny, one of the stories he grew up is that they originally he was murdered at Ripley by William C. Faulkner, but there was such a pressure on them that they had it recarved and put kill, which is a more moderate term. Well, the whole Heinemans were not ones to back down. I can tell you, they wouldn't have changed that for anybody. And of course, you can see that, this stone has certainly not been altered, so I have to chalk this claim about the changing the headstone up to just another tale about him. Yes. One of his claims to fame he's very well known for was his home, which I found out was called Warwick Place, which he apparently named after having visited Warwick Castle in England in 1883. And they claim that this was built, he built it in 1884 after his trip to Europe. And everybody said, well, he was so enamored with some Italian house in Italy that he came back and built this house to look like one. Well, maybe so, maybe not. One thing you can say is that this does not look out of place based on other styles that were common at the time. Look at the high gables on these porticos there. It's characteristic of Gothic Revival style. Here's an example of Gothic Revival. Look at the gables on the dormers up there. Very similar to Warwick Place. And then there's the brackets under the eaves, which are Italianate. Also very common, as you see in another Italianate home from the United States. So the stories grew up, about him. He was copying something over in Italy, he saw in Italy, when there's really no reason to believe that. This story that he was so violent, and historians have made him out to be a megalomaniac, even referred to him, several of them referred to him as a megalomaniac. And I see no justification whatsoever in that. If you read his travelogue, Rapid Ramblings in Europe, you see him constantly bantering with his traveling companions. He's making self-deprecatory humor. To me, it would be a megalomaniac. If he makes fun of somebody, it's going to be other people, not himself. But Faulkner always making light of himself. Here's an example of that. They were in a crypt under the Capuchin monastery in Rome, where there are a lot of dead bodies out that have been hung up and mummified. And he said he was standing there and he felt a small hand grab his index finger and try to break it off. And he said as a little girl, she thought he was one of these mummies there. And so when he looked down at her, she let out a screech and said, "Oh, Mama, that mummy is alive. I saw its head move." So throughout the travelogue after that, he would constantly refer to himself as looking like a mummy. And that doesn't sound like a megalomaniac to me. But this illustration leads me to another point, something that recently developed within the last couple of weeks. I used this illustration, it came from Rapid Ramblings in Europe, but I used it in my book. It illustrated his humor, but I also thought that it might possibly had been based on him, but I didn't really know where he got it from. It's supposed to be him, but I didn't know if the artist really used anything to base it on him. And about 2 weeks ago, Colonel Faulkner's great-great-grandson, Jim Price, whose father used to be an attorney in Oxford, sent me an image. He said it had come out of his grandfather's copy of Rapid Ramblings in Europe. And it was Colonel Faulkner. And clearly what they'd done is this is a studio shot. And they had set it up to look like they wanted the picture to look like in the book. Let's see if we can compare. Yeah, you can compare now. They turned the photograph into a lithograph. You see the setting has changed. There's no chair there or whatever that is with a rug draped over it. Or instead they've turned it into leaning up against stone masonry. But here we have the third known photograph of him, which I wish that I had known about before the book ever came out, because I certainly would have used it. Here's another photograph of his monument in the Ripley Cemetery. This has been the subject of a lot of distortions and everything. One of the stories you see mentioned in a lot of the literature said that Colonel Faulkner had commissioned the statue of himself while in Europe in 1883. He'd gone by and charged them to carve a statue of himself. Another variant of the story is that the family built it, had it constructed after his death and wanted to place it on the courthouse square in Ripley, but the county turned him down and they had to put it in the cemetery. Both of those stories, it turns out, are just total nonsense. His family did indeed commission the statue, the monument to be built. The stone was ordered from St. Andrews, Scotland. The statue on top was carved in Carrara, Italy, a famous place, source of marble and commercial sculptures. Earliest reference I found is from the Southern Sentinel newspaper. There's a brief blurb. It said, "We learned that a life-size statue of the late Colonel WC Falkner is now being executed in Italy that is to cost $5,000. So this is all well after his death. Now, a lot of the accounts, it's funny how a lot of people know nothing about stone. You'd think that if you deal with mortuary stone, you'd at least know granite from marble. You'd be surprised how many people don't even describe this statue on top as being granite. Of course it's not, it's marble. The pedestal below it, of course, is granite. And I had never seen any halfway decent measurements. People would throw out some measurement about this thing being 25 feet or 30 feet high. Nobody had ever attempted to measure it. Well, I did. I didn't get all the way to the top. I wound up getting a stick and putting it alongside him. Well, I've started out by measuring up. These are foot increments. The pedestal is 12 and a half feet tall. And then the marble thing, I couldn't get quite to the top there, so I had to put a stick up there with the foot increments shown down there, and up to the top it comes out at right about 6 feet tall. And then there's a base on the statue making it overall about 6.5 foot. So overall, the The monument is about 19 feet, give or take an inch. But it's amazing how many people give of height to this monument, and it clearly had no idea what it was, and nobody ever thought to get out there and measure it. Okay, have I think that's the last one. Yeah. Have the image of Colonel Faulkner from the statue looking outwards to the blue changeless hills beyond, and beyond that, the ramparts of infinity itself. So I'm trying to in doing this, I had to correct a lot of errors, but also try to give it a dimension try to bring him to life as being a very humorous person, but he's also kind of like a square peg in a round hole. He'd always come up with ideas that really didn't get accepted too well by the bureaucrats too well, and so he was always butting heads with people. In the end, his vision of the railroad was that kind of a square peg in a round hole kind of thing. People wanted a railroad to be brought to Ripley, but nobody even considered turning the dang thing into a transcontinental railroad. But he did. And he wound up linking it up to continue building south from Ripley. He linked up with a bigger effort called the Gulf and Ship Island Railroad, which is a company that eventually founded Gulfport. But its initial construction in 1886, 1887, 1888 was kind of questionable. It was a scheme that was set up for failure. A lot of questionable financial aspects to it. They were using state convicts. Matter of fact, the railroad, can you imagine this going on today? The railroad purchased the right to operate the state penitentiary, which was then where the new capitol is. They were running this penitentiary and using it as a source of labor. Well, that eventually blew up. They sent around inspectors and had a lot of questions about what was going on down in the south part of the state where the Gulf at Ship Island was being built. But Colonel Faulkner's camps and everything, they inspected it and they didn't see any problem to it. In the end, that effort to build Gulf and Ship Island Railroad came crashing down. R.J. Thurman, who had not wanted to get involved in that, he was kind of very orthodox. He wanted to keep his finances under strict control. He didn't see any point in going off in these risky efforts like Faulkner was doing. So Faulkner links up with the Gulf and Ship Island Railroad. The railroad crashes down, going bankrupt. Faulkner came up and purchased the part he had just constructed from Ripley south to Pontotoc and added it onto his railroad. So he was the only one that survived this big crash. He came up smelling like roses through it all. And Thurman, who'd been making all these bad predictions about how it's going to be a disaster, wound up looking like a fool. Well, Faulkner's always a laughable sort of guy. He must have not let Thurman forget it. Must have made a lot of sardonic comments. In the end, on evening of November 5th, 1889, Thurman was in his office on the west side of the Ripley Square. And Faulkner's going around. He sees Thurman in his office. He walks up to the door. He says something. I figured it's something like, kind of making fun of his failure to see what a success he'd become. And Thurman pulls out a pistol and shoots him right in the mouth, and he died about 29 hours later. They eventually acquitted Thurman, and I'm sure why that was that Thurman claimed that he thought that Faulkner was going to do something to him, that shooting Faulkner was just a self-defensive act, when it clearly wasn't. It was an act of rage, I'm sure of that. But that pretty well brought him to an end. But his end was brought about by this unlimited vision of things. And so this is where, of course, the title of the book comes from. A lot of people, I'm sure, wonder where in the world I got that from, but it comes from his vision to the blue, changeless hills beyond, and beyond that, the ramparts of infinity itself. Okay. All right. Does anybody have any questions? Is back here? Okay.
Still in Ripley?
No, it was torn down in 1937 to build a post office.
Oh, what a shame.
Yeah, it is.
All right, the other question is, when did the U get added to the Faulkner name?
William Faulkner added that. It was about 1919 or 1920. And this is about the time he was going around telling people that he had been a pilot in World War I and had been shot down and all of that. People say that, we thought that Faulkner had a steel plate in his head from his World War I injuries. Of course, there were no World War I injuries. He just made it up. It was about the same time he stuck a U in his name. And so I always say that, well, it's about the same, just adding something in. But Colonel Faulkner was always no U in his name. Any others?
And this question comes from a native son of Ripley, I believe.
That's correct. Kind of similar to the question about the U and the Faulkner. Do you think that William Faulkner, the writer's sort of almost kind of rewriting the history of his grandfather is, like you said, sort of perceived to be a megalomaniac? Was that sort of part of the Faulkner, the writer, myth-making of his family, and as part of his literary bent, obviously? Was he just sort of myth-making about creating this character almost based on a real person, his own grandfather?
Yeah, I think so. But one thing I've noticed is that he really didn't care too much about the facts. In the book, I make several comparisons early on about William Faulkner writing about the early history of Yoknapatawpha County. And this is when I am writing about the early history of Tippah County and the Chickasaw Session area. And I compare it with what William Faulkner described, particularly in his book, Requiem for a Nun. And all I can see is that the historical framework was so sloppy. And I just eventually quit making comparisons. It just wasn't any point, because he had made no real attempt at digging into the history of what was going on. And about his great-grandfather, he referred to him as being humorless and grim and very violent. But all he had picked up on was what people talked about. He had made no critical inquiry into this man. And so he just sort of incorporated a distorted version of Colonel Faulkner into Colonel John Sartoris. Anybody else?
We have a question. Actually, we've got a comment that leads to a question, I think, from the live stream. This is William C. Faulkner's novel, The White Rose of Memphis, is available for free on Kindle. Have you read White Rose of Memphis? Talk to us a little bit about his literary efforts.
Okay, White Rose of Memphis, I go into several pages describing it. It came out, it was first written about 1881 and appeared serially in the Ripley Advertiser newspaper at the time, and later on they published it as a single volume, and it went through many editions over several decades. And it really caught the public's attention. It was a story about a trip down the Mississippi River on a steamboat in which these characters decide to have a masquerade party the whole time, and everybody's supposed to take on personas. So one of them takes on the name of Ingomar, who was a barbarian chief in literature, not in reality. The town of Ingomar in Union County is named after this. Ingomar is on the Ripley Railroad, and the town's named after this character. And they were, Mary Queen of Scots, all these personas, and they're supposed to tell stories about their lives. And it involves these long stories that eventually involve murder, and the villain appears. He'd been in disguise all throughout, and at the last he's identified, and then he jumps into the river, and the hero goes after him, and the hero kills him, and then everything's right with the world. I would imagine it would be more enjoyable back in the 1800s than it would today. I eventually got into it, but it was kind of a struggle to really get involved in it. Anybody else?
One more comment then from the live stream, less a question and a comment. Cheryl Carroll says, you can see a copy of the telegram to J.W.T. Faulkner announcing the colonel's death on the Faulkner Mississippi Heritage Facebook page or on the William Faulkner Book Club Facebook page. So if folks are interested, you can look those up.
Yeah, those things are, by the way, in the special collections at the University of Mississippi. They were found in the depot in New Albany some decades ago. Anybody else?
Any other questions? Jennifer Ball.
So just trying to give William Faulkner the benefit of the doubt, is it possible that, he never knew his great-grandfather, is it possible that these stories were passed down to him? Maybe his father had a bad relationship with William Faulkner, and it could be explained by family relationships rather than maybe his public persona.
Well, I don't really attempt to explain it. All I can say is that, he did pick up on erroneous notions, and he never really attempted to go beyond that. He just kind of accepted stories and built his Yoknapatawpha fiction on those rather naively accepted stories. Anybody else?
Any other questions? We have copies of To the Ramparts of Infinity, Colonel WC Falkner and the Ripley Railroad. Got a question. You want to wrap it up? Hang on.
Making the announcement, I was going to ask a question about, can we buy one of your books here?
It's all right.
So this is the book, and we have copies of it for sale right over here.
I have no
And-
objection.
Yeah, right. Thank you all for being here. I hope that we'll see you this weekend for the candlelight tour or Friday night for the candlelight tour. Don't forget the open house Saturday. Come back next week for Turner Hunt from the Muskogee Nation. But now, help me thank Jack Elliott for this program.